it's like my violence is okay, your violence is evil. That's the narrative, that's being shoved down our throat, and I just don't accept it. I think if we talk about violence, we have to talk about our violence and your violence. Like we both have to talk about violence, and then in the end, we'll find out that NATO countries are very, very, very deeply in the violence game. It's not that we're bystanders and countries outside NATO, the BRICS countries like Brazil or Russia or India or China, or you said you talked to people in Indonesia, that the BRICS countries are responsible for the violence. No, Pascal, that's what's making it so hard. It's actually the NATO countries who've bombed most since 1945.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Dr. Daniele Ganser, who's a fellow Swiss historian and peace researcher. He's also one of the few Swiss who managed to gain an international reputation for his criticism on the US war machine and NATO warmongering, for instance with the books USA, The Ruthless Empire, or NATO's Secret Armies, Operation Gladio, and Terrorism in Western Europe. He regularly fills large auditoriums when giving public lectures all over Switzerland, Germany, and Austria, and all of this has led, without surprise, to a swath of online hate against him and the often levied accusation that he's a conspiracy theorist. Well, his criticism and analysis is what we want to discuss today, and a little bit about his support for Switzerland's neutrality initiative. So, Daniele, welcome.
Thanks a lot for inviting me, Pascal.
It's great having you here because you're a prolific speaker and writer and analyst, and you've been ostracized from polite society in Switzerland. Could you maybe start with, or could we start with how this happened? How you went from being at a university in Switzerland and a research doing research into this point where people are calling you names, like, and really bad names the whole time. How did you experience that?
Yeah, that's true. I was doing my PhD in history at Basel University, and my PhD topic was NATO's secret armies, so Operation Gladio and terrorism Western Europe. That was okay. When I published my PhD in 2001, people said, okay, that's a highly sensitive topic, but it's very interesting. I got a very good grade at university and all was fine. And then for 2 years, I worked with Avenir Suisse, which is a think tank in Zurich. And then I moved on to the ETH, Center for Security Studies. And in 2006, I published an article on World Trade Center 7 and the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And that's when it started. So basically, it started in 2006 when I said, I don't believe the 9/11 story. And then I published several times articles where I said, I think World Trade Center 7 was controlled demolition. I see no other way for this building to go down. And the American embassy then in Switzerland intervened and said, that's a conspiracy theory. So in a nutshell, next year is 26. Yeah, in next year I have 20 years of being called names for basically saying World Trade Center 7 was controlled demolition. And I also have a very bad Wikipedia entry. Yeah. So really, if you question 9/11, you have a lot of problems. Also in Switzerland. I mean, that was the big surprise. I mean, you're also Swiss, so it's two Swiss talking to each other. And I had this fantasy that here in Switzerland we can research absolutely everything, and that Swiss universities are absolutely free. I mean, I was teaching at Zurich University. I was teaching history students, correcting papers and all that stuff. And I liked it. I was happy to work with the students, and also teaching at Luzern University, also history students, and at Basel University, history students. But then when I realized that 9/11 is something you can't talk about at Swiss universities, still today, actually, then I created my own institute, and I'm now completely independent. I'm not part of a political party or a religious group or anything. I'm just an independent researcher, and I'm doing my thing.
And you're doing your thing very successfully. I mean, you're also in Switzerland, like your voice is one of those that people know, even if they even if they think your voice is strange. But the thing is, what gets me the most, and I just read another one of these articles about you, how people criticize you for using the concept of global family, I think, or what do you
Yeah.
call it usually?
I
Human
call in German it's Menschheitsfamilie. In German it's
Menschheitsfamilie.
Menschheits. So it's basically human family.
Yeah.
That's a concept that I use a lot. Can I quickly explain it?
Please do, please.
I've done such as a historian. I've researched so many wars. So like I've researched the Iraq War 2003 when the US attacked Iraq. I've also in this book I have 9/11 in it. I have Vietnam in it. I have Iran Contra. And then I realized that basically it's always the same pattern. You exclude one group of human beings from the family and you say they're evil, they're bad, we have to kill them. And that's always the war propaganda. So right now in Switzerland, the Russians are being excluded. They're bad. They have to be fought. Everything we do against the Russians seems to be, a good idea. And then I say, wait, wait, wait. We shouldn't do that. We should never exclude anybody from the human family. We should always remember that we're now 8 billion people in 193 countries on the world, and that everybody in every country basically wants to live. That's what they all want. Nobody wants to be bombed. And so I try to bring in this concept of human family in all my talks. I say, everybody here in the room is welcome. You're all part of the human family. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. It doesn't matter whether you vote or whether you don't vote. And if you vote, what parties you vote for. It doesn't matter whether you're born in Switzerland, born in Germany, or born in Afghanistan or Syria, because many people from the countries that NATO bombed, they also come to my talks. Then there's very poor people who come to my talks because they feel that they're being kicked all the time, and there are very rich people coming to my talks because they think these important topics that I cover. And I always say, and all the people that are not here today, they're also part of the human family. So I always try to do this very inclusive approach. And then I say, and within the human family, we shouldn't kill each other. So it's a very simple way of explaining that we shouldn't kill each other.
Yeah, and we shouldn't exclude people from the realm of those
Yeah.
who we judge to deserve protection, right? Every
Yeah.
one of us deserves protection. The thing is, the war machine and the propaganda machine constantly succeeds at doing that. And the interesting aspect of the wars that you also researched in detail is that often it is done by creating a schism between, the leaders, Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi people. And then they're like,
Yeah.
oh, we are getting rid of Hussein for the Iraqi people. So we're going to war to protect those that we bomb. Why does this work time and again?
It's this old story of the evil man. It was not only Iraq. Iraq was bombed in 2003. I think the more striking example is Libya, actually, in 2011, when the French and the Americans and the British and even the Swedes went along and bombed Libya. And now everybody can see Gaddafi is dead and the country is much worse off. So it's not this idea, and Pascal, I talked with my friends about it. When it was happening, when the war was happening in 2011, I said, "Oh, we shouldn't bomb Libya. It's one of those few countries in Africa that actually works. They have a very high level of development. They have." The HDI, Human Development Index. You can always look at how literate is the population, how many can read, what's women's rights, and infant mortality, and all these aspects. And so Libya was really a champion of Africa, and Libya was helping other countries in Africa. So it's going, why should we destroy the champion of Africa? And then my friend said, "Oh no, I've read something else in the newspaper, and the television basically said Gaddafi's evil, and we have to kill him." And I go, "That's crazy. That's just propaganda, to justify the war." But it's always very difficult because people tend to believe what they hear from mainstream media. It's changing now, thanks to YouTube channels like yours or Tucker Carlson or other big channels who are able to change the narrative a little bit. But I want to emphasize that people who sit in front of Swiss television every day, they generally think that it's important to arm Ukraine and that Switzerland must give up its neutrality and side with Ukraine and all the things that mainstream newspapers like the Neue Zürcher Zeitung is telling them. And that's always been the same. It's been the same with Afghanistan as well. Afghanistan is a very tricky one. The war against Afghanistan started on 7 October 2001, and 3 weeks before we had 9/11. So there I said, this is also a lie. And also Vietnam War, with the Gulf of Tonkin, it was also a lie. So my point is, Pascal, the wars start with lies, and the lies then are being fed to the population through mass media. Manufacturing consent, like Noam Chomsky said.
The fascinating thing to me, of course, you're absolutely right. The fascinating thing, though, is that the lies come out as lies. We know that the Gulf of Tonkin was a lie. We know that the
Yep.
weapons of mass
Tick
destruction were
that
a lie.
box.
We know that
Tick that
the little,
box.
yeah, we know all of them. We
Yeah.
know that Libya got destroyed and is now has open air slave markets, as Jimmy Dore keeps
Yeah.
repeating time and again. All of this
Yeah.
is known, and then it doesn't actually register. I mean, not register. It doesn't change the attitude of the people who were tricked into believing this. Can you explain this to yourself?
If you allow, I would like to disagree
Okay.
because in the recent years, in 2020 and 21, we had the Corona pandemic crisis, whatever you want to call it, and during the Corona crisis. I didn't take the vaccination. I didn't trust it, and I said I'm not going to take it. My kids didn't take it. My wife, my mother, my sister, we all didn't take it. So we were again labeled as what was the word? There was just again words for people who said they're not going to follow the Swiss government and take the vaccination. So we were as Corona Leugner, which basically in English means you say there is
Corona
no such thing.
denier. You were called a denier.
Corona deny, yeah.
Mm.
Okay, so I was not impressed. I mean, I've already been labeled conspiracy theorist because I said I don't believe the 9/11 story, and I've also been labeled as a understander of Putin, Putin Versteher,
Mhm.
because I said we shouldn't send any weapons to Ukraine. We should have peace talks in Istanbul and right away. And there were peace talks in 22 in March, as you know. I mean, and so the Corona years really made many people in my network, if I may say so, more aware that we're being driven by big narratives. And they were also like that. That's basically the group of people who didn't take the vaccination. And I'm doing work in the German speaking world. So that's Switzerland, Austria, and Germany as 100 million people. And of these 100 million people, 30%, so 30 million, didn't take the corona vaccination. It's rough numbers because you never know who's telling you the truth. But let's just take rough numbers, 30 million. And this group was really, really called names. I mean, badly. It wasn't like, okay, fair enough, it's your health. Everybody has his own way to decide. It was really, there was is very nasty, nasty names being called. So people don't forget. People don't forget. They know I was really slandered and I don't like it and whatever, or I couldn't go to the marriage of my good friend because I didn't have the vaccination and he said only vaccinated people can come to the marriage. Things like that happened. Crazy stuff. And so the group has become much bigger. The group has become much bigger. I'm only trying to tell you that yes, you're right. It's always the same. There's a war, and before the war, the lies are being spread. And your argument basically is, why don't people realize it's always the same trick? And I'm fully with you, but I tend to emphasize that now in the year 2020 and 21, these were basically the Corona years in Switzerland. In 22, it was again Ukraine and Russia, and but in the Corona years, the group that was becoming very sensitive to the question of narrative. What is a narrative? What is framing? How does framing work? How do you defend the area of what you can speak about and all these things? That group has become much bigger, and I actually see it in my public talks. There's even more people coming now.
I'm glad to hear that. And probably you're right. I mean, there something is changing slowly, but the we also see the crackdown from the other side now, again, even
Yeah.
harder with the EU now even sanctioning its own people. And the screws are just being tightened bit by bit. It's probably also a reaction of a system that is scared and afraid. But
But what is the effect? But what is the effect? I mean,
it's gonna speed
if
it
you
up.
tighten the screw, that's I've seen that. For instance, Thomas Röper from the Anti-Spiegel
Mhm.
was being put on a EU sanction list, and obviously, I read Anti-Spiegel, I read ARD, I read Apollut, I read
Yeah.
RT German, I read NZZ, so I read different newspapers, just to compare, what's their narrative. And that they actually sanctioned Thomas Röper from Anti-Spiegel is really, is pushing it to the next level. And I think people who realize this are becoming even more sensitive. You know what I mean? They go like, oh, okay, they really are afraid that this narrative will break down. Because Pascal, what was the narrative? The narrative here in Switzerland was Ukraine is right, Russia is wrong, because, Russia invaded on the 24th of February 22. And then I said, okay, yes, this invasion, I think it is illegal. That's my analysis. I said, this, you cannot invade in another country. Like France is not allowed to invade Switzerland. Switzerland is not allowed to invade France. Full stop. America is not allowed to invade Iraq. France is not allowed to bomb Libya. Germany is not allowed to bomb Serbia as they did in 1999. So that's the international law. But then I said, but this invasion into Ukraine, there was a history before that. There was the overthrow of the government of Yanukovych, 2014. That was illegal. And the NATO expansion into the east, that was a provocation for Russia. And also the claim or the invitation of George Bush, president in 2008, to invite Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. That really triggered it all. So if I put these elements into the narrative, people are now more open and they say, yeah, I didn't hear that. That I've never heard about the coup in 2014 or the civil war from 14 to 22. And I think obviously some people still don't want to hear it. You're right. I don't want to say that everybody's like open to new narratives, but I think generally in my bubble, I see a lot of interest in alternative information. That I say, okay, how if we start from scratch, how can I understand the war in Ukraine? How can I understand it? And then I usually take a historical approach, year by year and from a geostrategic perspective.
Which is the right way of going about it. We need to understand the genesis, the
Yes,
development of how something
step
came
by
about.
step.
But the narrative at the moment, or the people who claim narrative dominance, and also, in German we have that beautiful word of Interpretationshoheit.
Deutungshoheit.
Deutungshoheit, yeah.
Deutungshoheit. Deutungshoheit.
Sovereignty of interpretation. The people who
Yes.
claim that, they will tell you that if you explain the history, then you are excusing the invasion. But how is that possible that intelligent people, and I know intelligent people, like you and I, fellow historians in Switzerland, highly intelligent, and they do not comprehend that there's a difference between an explanation and an excuse? Why is that?
I think they are really stuck in their narrative, really. I mean, maybe they're also scared, that some of our analysis might be right. Like, just to give you a very practical example, in 2022, when the Russian invasion happened on 24 February, I gave public talks in Switzerland, like 1,000 people, people were coming, they were buying tickets, they were listening to my analysis. Outside of the building, there was the police, and outside, next to the police, there were demonstrators with the Ukrainian flag. And the demonstrators said Daniele Ganser shouldn't be speaking because, he really challenges the narrative of Russia is the only one to blame.
Mm.
And they said, that's not all right because Russia is the only one to blame. And inside the building, I said, yes, Russia is to blame for one part. And here I mean for the invasion.
Yeah,
Okay.
for the
For the
actual
that,
going over
for
the
the
border. Yeah, that's what
yeah,
Russia did.
that's what Russia has to be. That's, we can blame Putin for that. Okay. That's his part. But then Zelensky also has to be blamed. Zelensky came into power promising peace. That was in 2019. He promised peace. But then he bombed his own population in the Donbass. So that's many people in Switzerland don't even know this. I said, okay, before the Russian invaded, the Ukrainian government came to power promising peace, but then continued to bomb its own population. And I say that's also something that you really have to take responsibility for. If, as a government, you kill your own citizens, that's not good. Okay, that's not. You shouldn't do that. And then the Americans also have to be blamed. In 2014, they overthrew the government in Ukraine. I know there's a huge debate about it, but I take the Victoria Nuland telephone with Jeffrey Pyatt. Jeffrey Pyatt was U.S. ambassador in Kiev, and I know that you know it, but I just repeat it for the audience. Victoria Nuland was talking on the phone with the American ambassador in Kiev, and Victoria Nuland, obviously working in the State Department, being Vice Secretary of State, she said who should be in the new government, and that before the coup happened. And publicly, she said, we invested a lot of money into Ukraine, and that was under President Barack Obama. And he said later in a CNN interview, Obama said, we helped to transition power in Ukraine. But that's not really what happened. It was not helping. This was interfering, this was interfering on the Maidan. And I really looked at February 2014 very, very in much detail. And I'm absolutely 100% sure that snipers were shooting both demonstrators and the police, and that creates chaos. And Ivan Katkanovsky has worked on that in much detail. So to sum the story up, I was giving that talk inside and was saying, yeah, Russia has to be blamed, the US has to be blamed for the coup, Zelensky has to be blamed for killing its own population. So there's three groups that you have to blame. Now, what do you do? And I said, the best thing is just start talking to each other. Everybody accepts his own blame. And, then solve the conflict without further bloodshed. And outside, the police was really, in Germany, I was giving talks in Hamburg and in Kiel, same analysis, and they had like 10 police cars outside. But I usually had like 1,000 people inside the room wanting to hear the context of the Ukrainian war. And outside, maybe 50 people who demonstrated against my analysis. And I just said to myself, because I felt the pressure, I just said to myself, people during the Vietnam War who demonstrated at the Kent State, for instance, or other places, they also stood up and said, we don't accept the narrative of our government. And we don't accept the narrative of our mainstream press. And how can we do this? By giving public talks, by having communications like this on independent YouTube channels like yours, or by publishing books like this one. That's the only peaceful means that we have, because the government is obviously much more powerful. Yeah, but you're right. Some of our colleagues think my analysis is really wrong and Putin has 100% of the blame. But no, the funny thing is I'm totally convinced that my analysis is right. Part of the blame is with Putin. Part of the blame is with Joe Biden. Part of the blame is with Zelensky.
And the funny thing is, of course, that we are condemned to believe that we are right because we can't escape ourselves, right? It just doesn't work.
Yes.
But
Yes.
we use discursive methods in order to have interactions and figure things out and use sources and so on. What strikes me is that the other side of this argument often tries to shoot at our academic credibility. I read a lot of articles about you that say like, oh, so-called historian, so-called self-proclaimed peace researcher. There is no certificate of peace researcher that somebody could convey upon you. If you research peace, then you're a peace researcher. But they do that, and they shoot all of these ad hominem attacks while claiming intellectual superiority. And I still don't understand. I still don't understand why this group doesn't see the problem in that kind of argumentation. Have you had any kind of interactions with, like, let's say, academics of same level with yours?
I've had a talk at Basel. There's in Basel there's a place which is called Stadtcasino Basel, which is a big place with 1,400 seats. Okay, and I gave a talk there, and it was full. Okay, and then colleagues of mine, professors of history and sociology, organized an event at Basel University,
A counter event.
a counter event, and they didn't invite me to that event. They just wanted to say, okay, you can go to this talk of Swiss historian Daniele Ganser on Russia, Ukraine, US, and he will, you know, say that Russia is responsible for the invasion, but the US is responsible with the, enlargement of NATO but don't believe him. You should come to our event at university and believe us. So it was really, for me, it was strange because they really feared that their control of the narrative was slipping away.
Or their
And
interpretation of the world.
their interpretation of the world as NATO is always a force for good, the US is always a force for good, that was slipping away. So I do think right now it's even harder because, for instance, here in Switzerland, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung has also always written we should just support Zelensky and then he will win. And I said, I mean, Ukraine has roughly 40 million people. Russia has roughly 150 million people. So it's 100 million more. Why should Ukraine win? Can you explain me that? Russia has a military infrastructure which is much bigger. Ukraine is basically dependent on imports. They can produce almost no weapons themselves. So why on earth, even without taking sides, why on earth should the smaller one win against the bigger one? And so I was questioning this narrative from the beginning, and maybe that's another problem that I have. I really criticize the Swiss government for taking sides. Like the Swiss government on 28th of February took over all the economic sanctions against Russia. But these sanctions, very important point, they were designed by the European Union. And now I know that you know it, and I know it for sure, but some listeners might not know it. The European Union is not the same like Europe, okay? Switzerland is a country in Europe, but we're not part of the European Union. The European Union has 27 states in it, okay? Germany, Italy, France, they're part of the European Union. But Switzerland is not part of the European Union. So basically, these sanctions were not authorized by the UN Security Council because obviously Russia has a veto power there. But, Switzerland should not have followed this path of the European Union and imposed sanction on Russia. So I posted this on Instagram and on Facebook and everywhere. And then people said, well, okay, he even disagrees with the Swiss government, and I think that made it even more difficult for my analysis. But I stand very firmly with my analysis. I stand very firmly with it. Switzerland should stay neutral. We should not join NATO. We should not join the European Union, and we should, if anything, help Ukraine, US, and Russia to find peace. But the peace talks right now, they're not in Switzerland. They're in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and because Switzerland is not neutral.
No, we had that sham event last year in summer where we invited only the
Yes.
people from one camp and then called us like peace bringers, right?
Yes.
Peace organizers. But that's the fascinating thing at the moment. I mean, I live in Japan and I have a lot of discussions with Indonesian colleagues, with Indian colleagues, and from colleagues from the global South. from South Africa and so on, and they all tell me like, we don't understand Europe. I mean, we don't get it. I mean, this should be a no-brainer that
Yeah.
Ukraine should also be neutral in one way or another, and that you need to de-escalate, and that you cannot have these NATO troops right at the border of Russia at the same time. They also
Yeah.
say like, we don't support Russia going in. So this from the inside. Europe, like it seems to me that there's so much ideology and emotion that it really clouds the picture. And what's strange about Switzerland is that even in Switzerland, this it's we get a lot of this. We must not reward Putin talk. He cannot be
Yeah.
rewarded. And I'm like, this has nothing to do with a reward, my friends. And
Yeah.
plus,
Yeah.
Switzerland, I mean, you don't even, I mean, there's nothing you have you contribute to like rewarding. This is a brute fact of horrible warfare. Can you explain this to yourself, this narrative of rewarding?
My only explanation, Pascal, really is that Switzerland was put under a lot of pressure by the United States and by the European Union. That's the only thing. I don't really see. I mean, obviously, we didn't have a vote in Switzerland on this, whether we want to take over the sanctions against Russia. Because remember, the invasion was on 24 February 2022. And the Swiss government, which really is just 7 people out of 8 million. So these 7 Bundesräte then decided that we take over all economic sanctions against Russia. And I was going like, what?
But
This
they
we're losing neutrality right there.
Yeah, we did. But we had protests actually in Bern, especially of my party, the Social Democrats. They rallied people to protest, and until this day, people will tell you that they're indignated that it took the Swiss government 4 days to take this to impose these sanctions. They will, and this is a sizable number of people.
But I'm indignated that the Swiss government gave away neutrality without asking the population because, I'm not saying that the invasion was legal. I really agree with these people that the invasion was illegal. But Swiss neutrality was never designed in the way that it says Switzerland is neutral unless a country invades another country illegally. On that day, we'll throw away neutrality. Come on. Then we have to throw it away every year. Because if you take Germany, for instance, Germany under Chancellor Schröder and Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer bombed Serbia in 99. That was together with Bill Clinton. He was then president of the United States. And, France and Great Britain, they bombed as well. Now, this bombing of Serbia in 1999 is now almost forgotten. People don't want to talk about it anymore. But that was clearly illegal. You can't bomb Serbia just like that. And so Switzerland, if I follow the argument of these people, then should have thrown away its neutrality and put on sanction on Germany because Germany just broke international law. Then I say, no, we shouldn't do that. We should just tell Germany, well, you just broke international law, which they know, and we don't think that's a good idea. They don't care, but that's about it. That's all you can do as a small state. And then in 2003, when the Americans bombed Iraq, that clearly was a break of international law. You can then, write a letter to the US ambassador in Switzerland and tell him the Swiss government is unhappy that the United States has now just bombed Iraq. That's against international law. But you can't sanction then the United States. I mean, and we didn't. Obviously, we didn't. And in 2011, when the French, which France and Switzerland are neighboring countries, I just tell that to the audience. I mean, I know that but France is a neighbor of Switzerland. In 2011, France bombed Libya. And they said, oh, yeah, we have a UN mandate for that because the Security Council had said it's okay to have a no-fly zone. But out of this no-fly zone, then the French and the British and the Americans just made a regime change out of it. And that was never in the paper. I mean, if you look at the transcript of the Security Council, and I read these transcripts, I see there's no allowance for a regime change. So again, that was illegal. Did Switzerland then start an economic war against France? Of course not. So that's how I put it into a perspective. I take the last 30 years, I could even take the last 50 years, and I say, gee, I agree with you guys. There's been a lot of illegal wars, and guess what? I don't like it. But the principle of neutrality is that even if you see an illegal war, you stay neutral. You don't put economic warfare against one group. In this case, the Swiss government has decided we start with economic warfare against Russia. We don't send weapons to Ukraine. I mean, the Germans, they send weapons, and the British and the French, they send weapons to Ukraine. The Swiss, just to clarify this, we don't send weapons, for God's sake. But we do participate in an economic war, and that is not neutral. And that is really what disappoints me. I mean, at one point, we have to come back and stop it and say, okay, now that was a mistake. We stop it, and we have to write to the Russians and say, sorry, we shouldn't have done that. But right now, we're still in this economic war. And once it's over, I guess it will be easier to talk about it. Now we're in the middle of it, and people like me who speak out against it, we come under pressure. But I still speak out about it, and that's the good thing about Switzerland. With the freedom of speech, I've never had a public talk that was interrupted by the Swiss police, or that. No, I can give my speeches here publicly. People who come and listen to my analysis, they are grateful that we have this freedom of speech. So we're still a free country.
That is true. I believe that as so often in Switzerland, things boil as well, but on a lower level than, like, let's compare it to our big brother, the Germans. Their
Yeah.
their emotions and even laws and crackdowns and so on are always much harsher and harder. I had this discussion the other day because there's luckily, left and right, people have now the idea of using neutrality again, and one group does so in the about Australia. There's a group that would like to see a neutral Australia, and they asked
Okay.
me, but if we declare neutrality, would we also be would we, in order to maintain that policy to the fullest, would we also have to refrain from putting sanctions on Israel? Because that's not something we would like to do. I mean, Israel should be sanctioned. And of course, Switzerland doesn't sanction Israel. It sanctions Russia, but not Israel. I mean, because apparently these two cases are
You
incomparable.
can't compare them.
No,
Yeah, yeah. In Switzerland, you can't compare them.
no, can't.
That's
No,
that,
no.
that
But
that's if you talk about the Russians and if you talk about the Israelis in the same sentence, that's also already forbidden. It's not comparable.
yeah, yeah, the only thing that you are allowed to compare is Hamas and Mr. Putin. They are like,
Yeah,
there we have more
they're
like
evil.
Hamas, Putin, Hitler. This is like the
Yeah.
accepted norm.
No, but it's crazy, isn't it? It's
It
crazy
is.
how strongly the narrative is being shaped. I mean, as for Australia, I think Australia then couldn't send troops to Afghanistan as they did. So that's the question that I think is coming up for many countries: is neutrality an asset, or is it a liability? And I, from a Swiss perspective, really say it's an asset. Like the Swiss experience, is that you don't have to take sides if two groups are killing each other. You don't have to take sides. You can stay neutral, and you can say, okay, we see your grievances and we see your grievances, and that's very important. I think there has to be somebody outside of the direct confrontation who can actually listen to one person, or listen to the Russians in our example, or then listen to the Ukrainians. And they both have grievances. Obviously, the Israelis have grievances, and the Palestinians have grievances. They have pain, they have losses, undoubtedly so, but that doesn't mean that you have to jump on one side. It doesn't. And I'm really now. I'm 52. I've lived in Switzerland all my life, and I love the country. I love it. But that's why I'm so sad that within the context of Ukrainian war, the Swiss government, and again, the Swiss population has not been asked, but the Swiss government has sided with Zelensky. It's something I don't understand. It's a mistake. I think it's a strategic mistake.
I mean, we're trying to rectify that to a certain extent because there is a neutrality initiative that's rolling, and it will come either end of this year or early next year. But the question of how we got there is not just it's just also to emphasize that, Switzerland is not alone. It's like all of Europe. Europe maneuvered itself, and what I mean is Western Europe, I mean EU plus a few others, maneuvered itself into a place where this kind of ideological approach to international relations has overwritten cold, hard analysis of the type that you are doing and others are doing, and also that we get from the American side. It's overriding that analysis. It's overriding the sheer fact that Russia is winning this war and that what Russia is doing, and replaces it with, but it shouldn't. It's like saying like, oh, but gravity shouldn't pull me down. It's unfair. And that's new. We haven't had that 30, 40 years ago. There was a pragmatism in Europe, and that pragmatism got like shoved aside. Can you put your finger on like around when and that was and why?
I looked at newspapers in the 1970s, how they portrayed the Vietnam War.
Mm.
Swiss newspapers, that was an analysis I did many years ago. And I have to say, already then, the Swiss were following the American analysis blindly. They were saying, okay, we have to fight in Vietnam because, the Vietnamese from the north are communists, and, fighting communism, you just have to do it. So I do think that we've taken a lot of Washington narratives and just followed them for many years. But I think with the advent of the internet, we do have many different narratives now on offer, thanks to different YouTube channels. I really have to say so. I think many people, and I think I speak now for your audience, they prefer to watch your new YouTube channel instead of their national television, because they know the national television just gives the perspective of the government. And when I have to put my finger down on how Europe is now reacting, I think the really funny thing is, with the incoming of Donald Trump as the new president in January 2025 of this year, and with the will of President Trump that he says, and now I want to end this war in Ukraine. And I mean, he says it again and again and again. It was very strange or funny to see that Europeans were going, no, we don't want to end this war now. And this is something that opened the eyes of many people who saw that in France, Macron, in Great Britain, Keir Starmer, and in Germany, Merz. Those are the three nations in Western Europe who said, no, we don't want to end this war, and Zelensky will win, and we will just support him to the bitter end. So I think now France, Germany, and UK are really, really trapped in their own discourse, and they don't find a way out. But the easy way would be to say, oh yeah, we think the war should end, and we'll support all peace initiative. They could say that. I mean, it's not impossible to say such a thing.
No, but then 24 hours ago, Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign policy chief, and again announced that if we don't support Ukraine anymore, if we give in to a peace that Russia demands, then we would be rewarding Russia. Again, it's about giving something, as if though the war had been like a gift and not a horrible tragedy that it actually is.
But Kaja Kallas is not a force for peace.
No, she's not. I mean, but they try to make themselves look like that. I mean, Kaja Kallas is. I mean, okay, let's not go to her, but because also like of her own family past in Estonia, being a communist apparatchik and so on in the Soviet Union. But anyhow, in your books, you look at the United States also as an empire, right, and as a political construct with a lot of power outside of its immediate borders, right? Some of these power structures are very crude, like operations, like clandestine operations abroad. How big do you think these clandestine operations are like in within Europe, or the control of the Washington Empire over Europe.
Well, I do think that the NATO countries, these are 32 nations right now. So we have 193 nations on the world, and 32 are in NATO. And I think the US runs NATO. So I do think that the NSA has a lot of information on, German politicians, French politicians, and I do think that in every American embassy in Europe, you have a CA as a representative there who monitors the situation, and it's it's hard to say how powerful they are. We're talking about how influential is the US presence in Europe, but I just take things that I can measure. I see that Nord Stream, the pipeline bringing gas from Russia to Germany, was blown up. Okay, I mean, nobody's disputing it that it was blown up, but then Seymour Hersh comes forward, an excellent American journalist who says Joe Biden did it. I think, the US certainly did it. The question now is with Joe Biden, was he still in good shape back then? Did he know what he was talking about? We have this whole debate now about Joe Biden, which I think is a very important debate because, people say, he has been losing his mental capacity and he was not able to rule at all. So, but let's follow Seymour Hersh and say it was certainly Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, and Antony Blinken, Foreign Minister, who were involved. It was the White House who blew up Nord Stream. Now, I fully agree with Seymour Hersh. I think that's correct. And then I look at the Germans. Okay, the Germans get this report from Seymour Hersh that the U.S. just blew up their pipeline. And the reaction is zero. Pascal, to this very day, the reaction in Germany is zero. It's like, it's a mix of, we're not sure whether what Seymour Hersh is saying is right. He's an old man, or we're not sure, there are different stories and it's hard to find out what the truth is, or it happened too long ago. Let's move on. So it's really astonishing.
But it's even worse, Daniele, because the best case scenario for these people is that the narrative that is currently accepted in Europe is true. And that narrative says it was five people on a yacht, five Ukrainians on a yacht,
The
directed,
Andromeda.
the Andromeda, directed by the Ukrainian spy chief at the time, right?
Yeah,
Zelensky didn't know.
yeah.
But the best
No.
case scenario is that the allies that you are giving weapons to and that you are defending blew up. That's the best case scenario because in the worst
And it
case
doesn't make
it
much
was the
sense.
Americans.
And it doesn't make much sense, right?
No.
If people believe that, if they think, Zelensky, then the story went like, oh, yeah, but they were already too far away and Zelensky couldn't stop the operation. But if you, I mean, I think that's total, like, I just don't believe it. But if people want to believe that story, then I wonder, well, if you think Ukraine blew up your pipeline, why are you sending
Yeah.
millions, to Ukraine? Why are you not saying that's enough? We're not sending any money anymore. We're not sending any weapons anymore. Like, what's your logic? And Pascal, the problem is people are so stuck. They're like, oh, let's not talk about it. It's too complicated. And then I say there are American troops on German soil. If US has really blown up Nord Stream, you should send the 30,000 US soldiers home. You should say, you're not welcome here. If you blow up our infrastructure, and that's not a tiny infrastructure, this for the German economy, cheap energy is very important. And cheap energy is now not here anymore. So German economy is suffering. It's not something where you can say, oh, we couldn't use the gas anyway. We had too much energy anyway, and we have our own gas and whatever. No, 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 no. Germany was dependent on cheap gas from Russia. And when the Americans blow away the German Nord Stream, the German economy is suffering. And the German economy is really suffering. Look at the data. And so it's something that they should talk about, but they don't. because the narrative is so heavy. It's so heavy. Even in Switzerland, we don't talk about Nord Stream.
No.
It's probably conspiracy theories. And I say, yes, of course it was a conspiracy, because conspiracy means that two or more people conspired to do it the day before they blew it up. Okay, of course it's a conspiracy. That doesn't. They all come with these label conspiracy, and I say, hey, of course we have conspiracies. Do you think there's no conspiracies in the world? Wake up.
The Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, we all remember how Joe Biden stood next to Olaf Scholz at the time chancellor and actually threatened that something like that could happen, and Olaf Scholz just stood there and took it. I mean, all of these things
Yep.
are there, and yes, this is not a proof of who blew it up. It's just the audacity, right? At
Yep.
saying something like that in a press conference, and then things actually happen,
Yep.
which then still leaves this question open. What are the power structures that keep this in place? Because my view is that actually whoever blew up the Nord Stream pipeline did the Scholz government a favor, because it took a bargaining chip away from the people who opposed this government, right? I mean, you could not go
Yeah.
and demonstrate and say, like, open Nord Stream. If Nord Stream is gone,
Yeah.
it's gone. So that actually helped the Scholz government to
I agree.
silence its own critics. So there are, to me, there must be these not networks, but understandings, right? Political understandings of how the world runs. And I just wonder if you have more examples of the international dimension of how power then tickles down.
I think what we do have to understand that governments in NATO countries carry out terrorist attacks.
Mm.
That is, to many people, that's a total shock. They go, no, no, no. But blowing up a gas pipeline, blowing up the Nord Stream is a terrorist attack. That's clear. And I think the US did it. So the US is responsible for terrorism in Europe. And just for many people, this is very hard to swallow. But then I say, come on, there's nothing new. In 1985, the French Secret Service blew up the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior, which at the time was in New Zealand, in Auckland, and they were in the harbor, and they wanted, I mean, it's a long time ago, but Greenpeace was then protesting against French nuclear tests. So France is a nuclear power, and the French, carried out their first nuclear tests in Algeria, which was a French colony. But then Algeria got its independence in the early 1960s, and then the French said, "Oh, gee, where can we test our nuclear bombs? Not in France. We need some other place." And then they said, "Let's go to Mururoa." In the Pacific Ocean. And then the Greenpeace crew, which was just a small environmental organization, said, "Oh, we're against atomic tests. We're just going to drive there with our ship, the Rainbow Warrior." And before they could actually do it, the ship was in the harbor. And then the French Secret Service went to the ship and put explosives to the ship. One person died, one Greenpeace photographer, Fernando Pereira. He died because he went back into the ship. There was a first bomb, and then everybody left the boat. The French Secret Service didn't want to kill anybody. But then the photographer went back and I think was searching for his camera and his film. And then the second bomb went off and the whole ship drowned. But long story. At the time, François Mitterrand, socialist, was president of France. So, France has carried out terrorist attacks as well.
Yeah,
And this is just something we don't want to, Pascal, we don't want to talk about it. It's like, no, in NATO countries, we never carry out terrorist attacks. Yes, you do.
yeah, it just brings me back to this question. It's like, how is it that psychologically is possible? Because we have so many of those. I mean, we have the instance where Israel shot and almost sank a US warship.
Oh, the Liberty,
The Liberty.
USS Liberty,
We
1967.
we have the United States, doing terrorist attacks on Iran, destroying their centrifuges. We have, of course, Israel doing all of these terrorist attacks in all of the neighboring countries, including blowing up the attacking the Iranian consulate embassy, part of the embassy building in Damascus, in Syria at the time. And all of this seems to be just accepted. And of course, we have to go back to the narrative power of media. But there's so many illegalities, and those illegalities are fairly and squarely just accepted as a matter of fact.
Yeah, it's like my violence is okay, your violence is evil. That's the narrative, that's being shoved down our throat, and I just don't accept it. I think if we talk about violence, we have to talk about our violence and your violence. Like we both have to talk about violence, and then in the end, we'll find out that NATO countries are very, very, very deeply in the violence game. Okay, it's not that we're bystanders and countries outside NATO, the BRICS countries like Brazil or Russia or India or China, or you said you talked to people in Indonesia, that the BRICS countries are responsible for the violence. No, it's actually, Pascal, that's what's making it so hard. It's actually the NATO countries who've bombed most since 1945. I specialize on the last 80 years, so from 45 to today, and in this period, the USA has been the empire, the dominant military power, and they have bombed Serbia in '99. We've covered that. They've bombed Afghanistan in 2001. We've covered that, 20 years war and stuff. I just take the initial date. They've bombed Pakistan at the same time also. They've bombed Sudan in the 90s. They obviously have bombed Libya in 2011 with the French and with the English but they've also bombed Libya in the 80s, in 1986. And then they have bombed Vietnam from 1964 till 1975. And also they've bombed Laos and Cambodia, neighboring countries of Vietnam at the time. They've overthrown the government in Iran in 1953. They've overthrown the government in Guatemala in 1954. They've overthrown the government in Chile in 1973. They have bombed Nicaragua and armed the Contras in order to defeat the Sandinistas. They've made the invasion of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. They've bombed Cuba, tried to overthrow Fidel Castro. The CIA even had a department of assassins who tried to kill Fidel Castro. Then it never worked. It never worked. They tried to kill Fidel Castro. It never worked. It's adding up. It's really adding up. I've not even mentioned all the acts of violence, but this Western narrative that our violence is good and all the other violence is evil, it's just not very convincing. I think if we honestly speak about violence, we should come to the point, okay, your violence is no good, my violence is no good, let's stop it. That would be an honest approach to international relations, but we're not really there yet.
No, we're not honest, not at all. The thing is, some people, and the ones that I respect intellectually, are people like John Mearsheimer, a realist,
Excellent.
and he's an excellent analyst. But even he sometimes makes arguments where I wonder. One of his arguments is that we shouldn't get rid of NATO because the United States is an offshore balancer for Europe and can make sure that the Europeans don't go completely berserk and crazy and end up in another world war with Russia. Okay, fine. But what do you think about this? If you had a abolish NATO button in front of you, would you push it or would you not?
I would push it. I think NATO, first of all, is sucking in a lot of money. Okay, NATO is a lot of military spending, and the problem is NATO is now in a position that it's really pushing this evil Russia image every day. Every day, this is NATO propaganda. And I always say, if we talk about Europe, we should just remind ourselves of the fact that Russia, until the mountain of the Ural, is in Europe, okay? Because people always say the European Union or the NATO countries, that's Europe. Then I always go, well, Switzerland is not in the European Union and we're not in NATO, but we are in Europe. Don't forget that. And I think Russians are a little bit in the same boat. Like people say, Europe is fighting against Russia. It's like, Russia is in Europe, like Moscow is a city in Europe, like Paris or Rome and Berlin. So the strange thing for people who do this analysis is that they say we need Russia, we need NATO to protect us from Russia. My analysis is different. I say the extension of NATO after the fall of the Berlin Wall. In 1989, the wall in Berlin fell and Germany was reunited, which I think is great that Germany is now one country. But at that time, NATO had just 16 member states, and now it's 32. So it just doubled. And so I say the problem that we have in Europe is due to NATO moving east. Okay. In 99, Poland came in. Hungary, and this was the first enlargement, and in 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, a whole new group of countries came in. So NATO created insecurity. That's my analysis. I think NATO is not a force for peace. It is a force for instability in Europe. And it is a very expensive force. It's people paying millions and millions and millions into NATO, and it just creates instability. So I disagree with John Mearsheimer on that one, but I do think John Mearsheimer is an excellent man. By the way, Jeffrey Sachs also. I do think that the United States has very interesting scholars that speak openly about global events. And I think that thanks also to YouTube, it's just now possible to hear these different voices.
Yeah, maybe a last point. Do you see, as a peace researcher, a realistic way toward building a security architecture instead of a security community that then tries to make everybody their enemy? Because at the moment, the war faction clearly wants Russia and China to be the significant other to fight in Europe and in the Pacific, right? And then, but what we need is an architecture like a house that holds peace up. Do you have a sense of where this could come from?
I think now specifically for the war in Ukraine, the peace structure would be that Ukraine becomes a neutral country. Okay, it doesn't join NATO. It becomes a neutral country like Switzerland or like Austria or like Ireland. So I do think that the neutrality idea can be a building block for global peace. I mean, some people might think this is naive or whatever, but I'm firmly convinced that if we have Ukraine in a neutral state, then we have a possibility to stop the bloodshed. And this is possible. Ukraine could declare, okay, we promise we stay neutral. The Austrians did that after World War II. It's possible, The Swiss are neutral, so I think neutrality is a building block. Also, I think that we should not increase defense spending. I'm against it. Like if in the end we put all our wealth into weapons, it just makes the world a more dangerous place. It would be much more intelligent to take these are huge amounts of money, that we use them for communication, and communication not in the sense of propaganda, that the mass media is telling you whom you have to hate, but more of a comparison of histories, because a comparison of histories basically means that the Palestinians have a history and they have a perspective, and the Israelis have a history and they have a perspective. The Ukrainians have a history and they have a perspective. The Russians have a history and have a perspective. The Japanese have a perspective. The Chinese have a perspective. So, and then we should compare these different stories, compare stories without killing each other. And Pascal, we don't have to agree on the stories. It's okay that in the end we say, no, I think my story is more convincing than your stories. But I strongly advise as a perspective for the 21st century that we just compare stories, and that we say, oh, that's an interesting story, and I have a different story. I have, this was important for me. That's not in your story, but for me, that was an important element. and the other one says, oh, I didn't even think of that. That was not important for me. Because that's what we see on the very personal level. Like if a marriage breaks up, and the husband and the wife divorce, and it happens. And then you ask the husband, what's your story? He's going to give you a story.
Yeah.
And you ask the wife, and she's going to give you a story. And you ask the kids, they're going to give you a story. And I'm not arguing to say, and this is the right story and this is the wrong story. I argue that we, in order to have more peace, we should be so insightful to compare stories and understand that everybody has a slightly different story. And once we stay in this comparison and exchange of perspective without killing each other, life is still very interesting. But we should take our money to compare stories and to have infrastructure where we can understand that the other story is different instead of killing each other.
I know I said it was the last question, but if we take, and I find this a good idea, a narrative approach to understanding reality, should we
Yeah.
also should we also kind of dispose with the idea of universal facts and just say like, okay, everything is narrative, everything is story driven, and so what we need to do is to accept that people might believe in stories even if they didn't happen that way, or is that one bridge too far?
Well, I think there are certain facts. If somebody is killed and then, we write down when he died and where he died, that's the historians always write down the date and the place when somebody died. So there are some facts, but these facts are not that strong. I think the narratives are much stronger. And I think we in now in 2025, we are at the point where we can realize that we are being driven by narratives. And it will always be like that. But we can then carefully look at, okay, what is actually the narrative on the Ukrainian war? What is the narrative on the COVID story? What's the narrative on the Afghanistan war? What's the narrative on 9/11? What was the narrative on Vietnam War? And once we approach these big topics from a narrative perspective, we are much more prone to accept that somebody else has a different narrative.
Yeah.
Take Corona, in the family, we will realize that the other person has just had different news that he read, that he followed, that he had on his iPhone, on his smartphone, on his laptop, on his television, whatever. And based on these stories that he sort of believed, and followed, this is his narrative. And somebody else was listening to something else. And now we can come to the point of not saying, well, you should listen to my stories because I got the good news. I got the real, you should listen to Pascal and neutrality stories. That's the only perspective. No, of course not. That's one perspective in a million. But it's now the moment where we can wake up and say, okay, these narratives, if we believe them 100%, then we become dogmatic. So I really think we should not believe everything we think, on a very basic level, just be humble and say, okay, now I think this. Why do I think this? Oh, because I read that. And he said this, which I found convincing. But we should have it in a very playful mode. And once a new fact comes around, we should always be open to sort of change our analysis. And so this awareness of the power of narratives, this is something, if we get there, I think this can really, really strengthen the peace movement. Because as long as we're stuck in these narratives, the Russians are evil, we have to kill them, the peace movement is really in a difficult situation. But once we transform this narrative and say, okay, the Russians have some blame because they invaded, but the Ukrainians have some blame because they overthrew their own government in 2014. These were Ukrainians. That was not the Russians. And then they killed their own people. And so the Ukrainians have some blame. And the US has some blame because they extended NATO and invited Ukraine and Georgia and, sent javelins and whatever. So once we see the different narratives, I think that that will make us more tolerant. And I think we really need that.
I think so too. And Daniela, I thank you very much for these insights and analysis. People who want to read and see more of you, I suppose they should just go to your homepage. Is that so?
Yeah, that's correct. My first name is Daniele, so there's an E at the end. It's Daniel and Dani because I was born in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland in Lugano, and that's where you speak Italian. So there's the Italian version. And Ganser is my second name. You put on my first name, my second name, and you find me on the internet. You find me on YouTube, and you can find my book USA: The Ruthless Empire, which is a critique of the American government, not the American people.
I'll put all of these links into the description below. Everybody, check it out. And Daniele Ganser, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Pascal.